Insomniac has had a long history of making many original games, starting all the way back on the PS1 with the Spyro the Dragon trilogy. This charming set of action platformers quickly became an icon for the PlayStation family. Instead of continuing the series during the PS2 generation, they opted to create something completely new with Ratchet & Clank. It still retained some of the action platformer gameplay, but in a completely new setting and cast of characters. The PS3 generation saw them create a trilogy of first-person shooters with an interesting setting and memorable weapons. Insomniac then partnered with Microsoft to create the underrated Sunset Overdrive, and then were given the keys to the Spider-Man IP to create an original story and game exclusively for the PS4. This developer has a long history of making memorable hits, but all of this would have never happened had they never decided to make a game that was heavily influenced by Doom. Resistance was not their first foray into the first-person shooter genre. Their very first game, even before Spyro on the PS1, blended FPS action with live-action cheese. Join me as we take a look back at Disruptor. Ted Price graduated from Princeton and was working at a medical company when he ultimately decided to leave his current career path for a passion in the games industry. From a young age, he had a huge love for video games and even asked his father to buy him an Apple IIe so that he could even make them. Even at a young age, Ted had a creative drive which led him to creating a small company as an adult and hired a few talented programmers for their studio. Their first task was to find a name for themselves. The following names were tossed around: Outzone, Planet X, Extreme Software. Other names were discussed, like Ragnarok Software, along with Resistance Incorporated. Ted Price suggested the name Insomniac, and before they could officially choose a name, it would need to be cleared by legal, and Insomniac ended up being the very first one to do just that. Once Insomniac was officially formed, they were hard at work on their first game. The studio was very interested in making a first-person shooter. Doom was their main influence, and each of the developers found Doom to be a mind-blowing experience and felt that it helped to transform the industry. They felt that since Doom had a lot of love and respect around it, Insomniac could use this as an opportunity to leverage the excitement from id's successful first-person shooter for their own game. They wanted to use Doom as a template and make it unique with interesting weapons and powers the player could use. The developers were largely in unknown territory, with many of the team being quoted as saying, "We didn't really know what we were doing, but a Doom clone was something that felt doable." The first-person shooter would be known as Disruptor, and Insomniac found a publisher for the game with Universal Interactive Studios. They began work on their first-person shooter for the 3DO. At the time, the dev kits for the system were low compared to the competition, and Sony was not making dev kits available to everyone. At the time, people within the industry thought that the 3DO was going to be a hit, but about halfway through the development of Disruptor, Insomniac was able to read the writing on the wall for the future failure of the 3DO. At the same time, the developers crossed paths with Mark Cerny, who would later go on to be an important designer for Sony's future consoles. During the development of Disruptor, Cerny was an executive producer at Universal Interactive and one who had a lot of faith in this project. He felt that Disruptor would probably have a better chance at success on the Sony PlayStation, so the studio made the hard and ultimately right decision to completely convert their built engine to run on the PS1. Cerny was also seen as a mentor for many of the developers, and saw the talent of this young studio and helped to guide them through this project.
If you can survive the Lightstorm training, you will bear the awesome responsibility of defending global democracy throughout the regions of space. Who knows? Perhaps one day you'll find yourself sitting behind this desk as President of United Earth, Commander-in-Chief of the Lightstorm Forces.
Okay, little brother. This is your last chance to change your mind and go home.
After the studio made the switch to focusing on the PlayStation, they had a limited amount of time to finish their game to get it out to the public. They opted to go with live action for their cutscenes. This was a way for the company to cut costs while also providing story to texture the action better. In addition, since the publisher was Universal, they had access to many actors and crews that they could use to create these story sequences. Insomniac saw what was accomplished with the live action sequences in Warhawk and felt inspired to do something similar. The team wrote the script to their story and set out to find the crew and actors for their cutscenes. The development of Disruptor really showed how this new and small team could understand what made Doom special, while putting their own spin on it. Along with this, the team needed to make the hard decision to pivot from the failing 3DO and finish developing their game for the Sony PlayStation. This was a sink or swim situation for the studio, and proved that when the chips were down, they could release their game. Disruptor ended up being known as the Dark Horse first-person shooter for that year. Some of the developers on the original Doom even praised it for its quality. Disruptor was not a financial success for the studio, but it did open the door for Insomniac to eventually work on a lovable purple dragon for the platform. Disruptor was the game to get their feet wet within the industry and start those relationships with Sony. In November 1996, Disruptor was released to the world. Disruptor is a short and sweet game that takes much of its gameplay inspiration from the original Doom. This game is fun right out of the gate with easy to understand controls and enjoyable action. The shooting is solid and provides a good variety of guns and many unique enemies to destroy. The developers made several attempts to make this more than just a simple Doom clone. For one, the player would have access to some cool abilities, and the live action cutscenes would provide a narrative to guide the action along. The cutscenes entered into a so bad it's good territory, where the FPS action holds up pretty well. Disruptor is a good game for a brand new studio. Disruptor's controls are rather simple. You can jump, shoot, strafe, use your powers, and that is pretty much it. For the most part, the controls hold up well. The shooting is pretty good with some nice punchy sound effects. You will even notice this with the starting pistol. There's a good variety of weapons from your pistol, SMG, shotgun, plasma gun, a homing grenade launcher, and a few more. One thing that I thought was really impressive is how new enemy types would often get introduced in each level. There were a few times where clones of older enemies would show up, but there's a good variety of different foes to shoot at. You will fight bugs, monsters, robots, mechs, and even space pirates. Disruptor's gameplay will largely remain the same in each level. Shoot all of the enemies and find the exit. Levels range from underground bases, rooftops, large outside areas, the surface of Mars, along with an ice planet. The variety in the guns, enemies, and visual design is impressive. Just like in Doom, there are some opportunities for finding secrets, but do not expect Disruptor to have a large amount of them. While most of the levels feature similar mission objectives, there are a few that help to change things up. For example, the level on Mars has you starting out with no weapons, only relying on your powers to survive. Usually you start your missions off with some weapons, but here you need to spend most of the level building up your arsenal. It is a nice change of pace. Another level has you need to complete objectives very quickly before a timer runs out. You need to hit certain switches to complete the mission, and in many cases you will need to make the quick decision to either run away to dodge most of the enemies to stay within the time limit or defeat them. This is a level that I died a lot on. While it was rather short, you will find yourself trying to be as efficient as possible. Disruptor tries to set itself apart from Doom through its use of psionic powers. You get a few different powers over the course of the campaign. You can shoot lightning, drain energy that will damage your foes, and refill your power bar. Healing, which becomes very useful later in the game, along with shooting a powerful blast and a shield. Disruptor does a good job of slowly introducing new weapons and powers to the player throughout the campaign. For a large amount of the game, you always had something new to try out or play with. Overall, the game is solid from a gameplay standpoint. The story, on the other hand, ends up being so bad it's good, and it sort of turns a flaw into a positive for the game. The dialogue and acting are very cheesy and are unintentionally hilarious. I grew up playing Command & Conquer titles, so I love cheesy live-action cutscenes. And here, the budget is very low, and I will let some of the cutscenes speak for themselves.
What is it? A gang of cryo-pirates just pulled into orbit over Jupiter. Looks like we've got to find someone to beam onto their base and knock out their anti-gravity engines. I think you can handle this. But before we send you into combat, you're gonna need some medical enhancement.
Well, I've already taken advanced first aid at the academy.
Look, you didn't get all this high-priced training just to get blown away by pirates. We need to protect our investment. Considering the cost of medical care, I think you'll appreciate what I'm offering. Before we send you halfway across space, let's take a trip to the Psionics lab.
While I enjoyed the cheesy story and the solid gameplay, there are some flaws that I found within the game. For one, unlike Doom, you can jump in Disruptor. The problem with this is that the jump can feel very clunky. Part of this is from the very fast movement mixed with the jumping to create some situations of imprecision. I do appreciate how the game was trying to add in a mechanic that was not found in its biggest influence, but it needed more refinement here. I found some missions to be just a bit too long, to the point that they felt like they dragged on. There are a few situations where enemies are rather cheap and do way too much damage. The enemies that use the homing grenade launcher are a good example of this. There were a few situations where I felt like the game was being a bit too stingy with the ammo, and I had to use the melee weapon, which was not useful at all. And the last few stages can be very punishing to the point that they felt very cheap and not well balanced. Disruptor does have some frustrations, but overall the story is dumb fun, with some good classic FPS action. Before we move to the conclusion, I want to mention the soundtrack. Many of the levels have memorable tunes, and here are a few tracks from the game. Disruptor is a solid FPS and a good first outing for a new studio. The game itself has solid gameplay with some fun weapons, varied locations, and a good amount of different enemies to shoot at. From a development side of things, it really showed how a studio needed to adapt to ensure that their game even had a chance at success. The decision to switch from the development on the 3DO to the PlayStation was ultimately a good move. That took an incredible amount of talent and risk to try and give their game the best shot it had. While Disruptor did not end up selling well for the studio, it did receive some recognition even from some of the original Doom team. And most of all, this was the game that got Insomniac's foot in the door to create one of PlayStation's mascot characters. They may not have seen the financial success with their first outing, but they proved that they could make a good game. And as we all know, following Disruptor, there were many great games on the horizon from them. I recommend you check out Disruptor, and thank you very much for watching.